Okay, ladies and gentlemen, welcome back to what I think is the 10th reading of the Graveyard Book. When we last left it, Bod had been on a little adventure to the Ghoul Kingdom, but he's now back, as is Silas, his guardian in the graveyard, who we suspect is a vampire. Silas had been off on a mysterious mission, but we don't know where Silas has been. The next chapter is called The Witch's Headstone, so let's jump straight in. There was a witch buried at the edge of the graveyard. It was common knowledge. Bod had been told to keep away from that corner of the world by Mrs. Owens as far back as he could remember. Why? He asked. "'Tain't healthy for a living body," said Mrs. Owens. "There's damp down that end of things. It's practically a marsh. You'll catch your death." Mr. Owens himself was more evasive and less imaginative. "Well, it's not a good place," was all he said. The graveyard proper ended at the bottom of the west side of the hill beneath the old apple tree, with a fence of rust-brown iron railings, each topped with a small rusting spearhead. But there was a wasteland beyond that, a mass of nettles and weeds, of brambles and autumnal rubbish, and Bod, who was, on the whole, obedient, did not push between the railings, but he went down there and looked through. He knew he wasn't being told the whole story, and it irritated him. Bod went back up the hill to the little chapel near the entrance to the graveyard, and he waited until it got dark, which is when Silas appears. As twilight edged from grey to purple, there was a noise in the spire, like a fluttering of heavy velvet, and Silas left his resting place in the belfry and clambered headfirst down the spire. "What's in the far corner of the graveyard?" asked Bod, past Harrison Westwood, baker of this parish, and his wives Marion and Joan. "Why do you ask?" said his guardian, brushing the dust from his black suit with ivory fingers. Bod shrugged. "Just wondered." "It's unconsecrated ground," said Silas. "Do you know what that means?" "Not really," said Bod. Silas walked across the path without disturbing a fallen leaf and sat down on the bench beside Bod. "There are those," he said in his silken voice, "who believe that all land is sacred, that it is sacred before we come to it, and sacred after. But here in your land, they bless the churches and the ground they set aside to bury people in, to make it holy. But they left land unconsecrated beside the sacred ground, potter's fields, to bury the criminals and the suicides or those who were not of the faith. So the people buried in the ground on the other side of the fence are bad people?" Silas raised one perfect eyebrow. "Oh, no, not at all. Let's see, it's been a while since I've been down that way, but I don't remember anyone particularly evil. Remember, in days gone by, you could be hanged for stealing a shilling. That's about 5p. And there are always people who find their lives have become so unsupportable, they believe the best thing they could do would be to hasten their transition to another plane of existence." He's talking about suicides there. "They kill themselves, you mean?" said Bod. He was about 8 years old, wide-eyed and inquisitive, and he was not stupid. "Indeed. Does it work? Are they happier dead?" "Sometimes. Mostly no. It's like the people who believe they'll be happy if they go and live somewhere else, but who learn it doesn't work that way. Wherever you go, you take yourself with you, if you see what I mean." "Sort of," said Bod. Silas reached down and ruffled the boy's hair. Bod said, "What about the witch?" "Yes, exactly," said Silas. "Suicides, criminals and witches. Those who died unshriven." He stood up, a midnight shadow in the twilight. "All this talking," he said, "and I haven't even had my breakfast. While you will be late for lessons." In the twilight of the graveyard there was a silent implosion, a flutter of darkness, and Silas was gone. The moon had begun to rise by the time Bod reached Miss Pennyworthy's mausoleum, and Thomas Pennyworth, here he lies in the certainty of the moth glory of resurrection, was already waiting, and was not in the best of moods. "You are late," he said. "Sorry, Mr. Pennyworth." Pennyworth tutted. The previous week, Mr. Pennyworth had been teaching Bod about elements and humours, and Bod had forgotten which was which. He was expecting a test, but instead Mr. Pennyworth said, "I think it is time to spend a few days on practical matters. Time is passing after all." "Is it?" asked Bod. "I'm afraid so, young Master Owens. Now, how is your fading?" Bod had hoped he would not be asked that question. "It's all right," he said. "I mean, You know. No, Master Owens, I do not know. Why do you not demonstrate for me? Bod's heart sank. He took a deep breath and did his best, squinching up his eyes and trying to fade away. Mr. Pennyworth was not impressed. Ha! That's not the kind of thing. Not the kind of thing at all. Slipping and fading, boy. The way of the dead. Slip through the shadows, fade from awareness. Try again. Bod tried harder. You're as plain as the nose on your face, said Mr. Pennyworth, and your nose is remarkably obvious, as is the rest of your face, young man. As are you. For the sake of all that is holy, empty your mind. Now, you are an empty alleyway. You are a vacant doorway. You are nothing. Eyes will not see you. Minds will not hold you. Where you are is nothing and nobody. Bod tried again. He closed his eyes and imagined himself fading into the stained stonework of the mausoleum wall, becoming a shadow of the night and nothing more. He sneezed. "Ugh, dreadful," said Mr. Pennyworth with a sigh. "Quite dreadful. I believe I shall have to have a word with your guardian about this." He shook his head. "So, the humours. List 'em. Sanguine, choleric, phlegmatic. I'm not sure what the humours are. I think they're an old-fashioned medical thing. And the other one, melancholic, I think. And so it went until it was time for grammar and composition with Miss Letitia Burrows, spinster of this parish, who did no harm to no man in all the days of her life. Reader, can you say likewise? Again, I think that's what's written on her tombstone. Bod liked Miss Burrows and the coziness of her little crypt, and that she could all too easily be led off that subject. They say there's a witch in unconsecrated ground, he said. Yes, dear, but you don't want to go over there. Why not? Miss Burrows smiled the guileless smile of the dead. They aren't our sort of people, she said. But it is a graveyard, isn't it? I mean, I'm allowed to go there if I want to. That, said Miss Burrows, would not be advisable. Bod was obedient, but curious. And so, when lessons were done for the night, he walked past Harrison Westwood, Baker, and Family's Memorial, a broken-armed angel, but did not climb down the hill to the Potter's Field. Instead, he walked up the side of the hill to where a picnic some 30 years before had left its mark in the shape of a large apple tree. There were some lessons that Bod had mastered. He had eaten a bellyful of unripe apples, sour and white, picked from the tree years before, and had regretted it for days. His guts cramping and painful whilst Mr. Owen lectured him on what not to eat. Now he always waited until the apples were ripe before eating them, and never ate more than 2 or 3 a night. He had finished the last of the apples a week before, but he liked the apple tree as a place to think. He edged up the trunk to his favourite place in the crook of the 2 branches, and looked down at the Potter's Field below him, a brambly patch of weeds and unmown grass in the moonlight. He wondered whether the witch would be old and iron-toothed and travel in a house on chicken legs, or whether she would be thin and sharp-nosed and carry a broomstick. Bod's stomach growled, and he realised that he was getting hungry. He wished he had not devoured all the apples on the tree, that he had left just one. He glanced up and thought he saw something. He looked round. So he looked once, looked twice to be certain. An apple, red and ripe. Bod prided himself on his tree-climbing skills. He swung himself up branch by branch and imagined he was Silas, swarming smoothly up a sheer brick wall. The apple, the red of it almost black in the moonlight, hung just out of reach. Bod moved slowly forward along the branch until he was just below the apple. Then he stretched up and the tips of his fingers touched the perfect apple. He was never to taste it. A snap, loud as a hunter's gun, as the branch gave way beneath him. A flash of pain woke him, sharp as ice, the colours of slow thunder, down in the weeds that summer's night. The ground beneath him seemed relatively soft and oddly warm. He pushed a hand down and felt something like warm fur beneath him. He had landed on the grass pile, where the graveyard's gardener threw the cuttings from the mower, and it had broken his fall. Still, there was a pain in his chest, and his leg hurt as if he had landed on it first and twisted it. Bod moaned. Hush, you husher boy, said a voice from behind him. Where did you come from, dropping like a thunderstone? What way is that to carry on? I was in the apple tree, said Bod. Ah, let me see your leg, broken like the tree's limb, I'll be bound. Cool fingers prodded his left leg. Not broken, twisted, yes, sprained perhaps. You have the devil's own luck, boy, falling into the compost. Tain't the end of the world. Oh, good, said Bod. Hurts, though. He turned his head and looked up and behind him. She was older than him, but not a grown-up, and she looked neither friendly nor unfriendly. Wary, mostly, which means she's sort of worried about things, possibly, like, a bit cautious. She had a face that was intelligent, and not even a little bit beautiful. I'm Bod, he said. The live boy? She asked. Bod nodded. I thought you must be, she said. We've heard of you, even over here in the Potter's Field. What do they call you? Owens, he said. Nobody Owens. Bod for short. How do you do, young Master Bod? Bod looked her up and down. She wore a plain white shift. That's like a night dress. Like a shapeless white robe. Her hair was mousy and long, and there was something of the goblin in her face. A sideways hint of a smile that seemed to linger no matter what the rest of her face was doing. Were you a suicide, he asked. Did you steal a shilling? Never stole nothing, she said. Not even a handkerchief, anyway, she said pertly. The suicides is all over there, on the other side of that hawthorn, and the gallows birds, the people that got hung on the gallows, are in the blackberry patch, both of them. One was a coiner, t'other a highwayman, or so he says. And though if you ask me, I doubt he was more than a common footpad thief and a night walker. Ah, said Bod. Then, suspicion forming tentatively, he said, They say a witch is buried here. She nodded. Drowned and burned and buried here without as much as a stone to mark the spot. You were drowned and burned? She settled down on the hill of grass cuttings beside him and held his throbbing leg with her chilly hands. They come to my little cottage at dawn before I'm proper awake and drags me out onto the green. You're a witch, they shouts, fat and fresh, scrubbed all pink in the morning like so many pig wiggins scrubbed clean for market day. One by one they get up beneath the sky and tells of milk gone sour and horses gone lame, and finally Mistress Jemima gets up, the fattest, pinkest, best scrub of them all, and tells how as Solomon Porritt now cuts her dead and instead hangs around the wash house like a wasp about a honey pot, and it's all my magic, she says, that made him so, and the poor young man must be bespelled. So they strap me to the cucking stool and forces it under the water of the duck pond, saying if I'm a witch I'll neither drown nor care, but if I am not a witch I'll feel it. And Mistress Jemima's father gives each of them a shilling groat, each a silver groat, that's an old coin, to hold the stool down under the foul green water for a long time to see if I choke on it. And did you? Oh yeah, got a lung full of water. It done for me. It killed me. Oh, said Bod. Then you weren't a witch after all. The girl fixed him with her beady ghost eyes and smiled a lopsided smile. She still looked like a goblin, but now she looked like a pretty goblin. And Bod didn't think she would have needed magic to attract Solomon Porritt. Not with a smile like that. What nonsense. Of course I was a witch. They learned that when they untied me from the cucking stool and stretched me out on the green, 9 parts dead and all covered with duckweed and stinking pond muck. I rolled my eyes back in my head, and I cursed each and every one of them there on the village green that morning, that none of them would ever rest easy in their grave. I was surprised at how easily it came, the cursing. Like dancing it was. When your feet pick up the steps of a new measure your ears have never heard, and your head don't know, and they dance it till dawn. She stood and twirled and kicked, and her bare feet flashed in the moonlight. That was how I cursed them, with my last gurgling, pond-watery breath. And then I expired, died. They burned my body on the green until I was nothing but blackened charcoal, and they popped me in a hole in the Potter's Field without so much as a headstone to mark my name. And it was only then that she paused and seemed for a moment wistful, kind of a little bit sad at things gone by. Are any of them buried in the graveyard then? Asked Bod. Not a one, said the girl with a twinkle. The Saturday after they drowned and toasted me, a carpet was delivered to Master Porringer all the way from London town, and it was a fine carpet. But it turned out there was more in that carpet than strong wool and good weaving, for it carried the plague in its pattern, and by Monday 5 of them were coughing blood, and their skin were gone as black as mine when they hauled me out of the fire. A week later, and they'd taken most of the village, and they threw the bodies all promiscuous in a plague pit they dug outside of the town that they filled in after. Was everyone in the village killed? She shrugged. Everyone who watched me get drowned and burned. How's your leg now? Better, he said. Thanks. Bod stood up slowly and limped down from the grass pile. He leaned against the railing. So were you always a witch? He asked. I mean, before you cursed them all? As if it would take witchcraft, she said with a sniff, to get Solomon Porritt mooning round my cottage. Which, Bod thought, but did not say, was not actually an answer to his question at all. What's your name? He asked. Got no headstone, she said, turning down the corners of her mouth. Might be anybody, mightn't I? But you must have a name. Lisa Hempstock, if you please, she said tartly. Then she said, it's not that much to ask, is it? Something to mark my grave. I'm just down there, see, with nothing but nettles to show where I rest. And she looked so sad just for a moment that Bod wanted to hug her. And it came to him, as he squeezed between the railings of the fence, he would find Lisa Hempstock a headstone, with her name upon it. He would make her smile. He turned to wave goodbye as he began to clamber up the hill, but she was already gone.